At some point, when you have all these polluting sites in one community, you got to stop giving out pollution permits. And this is not fair. At some point, you got to say enough is enough.
I'm Dr. Lamont Repollet, the president of Kean, New Jersey's Urban Research University. This is Urban Impact, a podcast where we examine the complex issues facing urban communities through meaningful conversations with scholars, community leaders, and others who are driving change. Recorded and produced on our campus in Union, New Jersey, this is Urban Impact. Here are your hosts, Michael Salvatore and Barbara George Johnson.
I'm looking forward to our next topic today, Barbara, because it's one that affects not just us here in New Jersey, but one that affects our entire country, in fact, the entire planet.
It gives me great pleasure to have with us Dr. Nicky Sheats, who is the director of the Center for Urban Environment at the John S. Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research. Dr. Sheats is well known in the area of environmental justice. He's been engaged in that field way before environmental justice became the hot, sexy topic that it seems to be today. So we look forward to hearing from him and having a really robust conversation on what's happening in that field, particularly in urban communities.
Did you say hot and sexy topic?
Sure did.
Urban. Okay, environmental justice. It does something for everybody. Dr. Sheats, you've dedicated so much of your time and your work and your passion toward climate change and environmental justice, but the reality is not everybody knows what that means. They've heard climate change, but environmental justice. Help us define and frame environmental justice.
Let me go to the heart of environmental justice. The heart of environmental justice is trying to ensure that communities of color and communities with low income do not have elevated levels of pollution. And unfortunately, that's what we often find around the country. That these communities, we call them environmental justice communities, suffer from disproportionate pollution loads. And the worry about that is that these disproportionate pollution loads are associated with the health disparities that exist in our country. So we worry that one reason we have these persistent health disparities that are rooted in race and income is because of the disproportionate pollution loads that we often find in communities of color and low-income communities.
You were recognized by Grist magazine as one of 50 people in the U.S. performing important environmental and environmental justice work. If you can kind of give me a sense of your journey from being a social justice attorney for the most part and what got you into this area of public policy.
Sure, and thanks for asking the question. Most people that know me now, they don't even know that this is actually a second career for me. My initial career, when I was young, Barbara, as you indicated, I was a public interest attorney. So I got out of law school and I clerked for a judge down in D.C., an appellate court, and then I was a legal services attorney and I was a public defender. And then I took a turn and I went back to school for science. And I had to take undergraduate science courses, which I took at the City College of New York. And then I went, it's actually back to Harvard because I had done my law degree and public policy degree at Harvard. So I went back to Harvard to study sciences, earth and planetary sciences. And while I was there, I started to wonder, because remember, I grew up in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. So I wasn't old enough to be a part of the Civil Rights Movement, but that's my political frame for everything. And I grew up, I was in the first big wave of affirmative action when I went to Princeton University undergrad, and the first wave of black students coming into, all majority white schools basically in the country. And I felt like I had an obligation to help my community. And I did that through the law. And it was pretty easy to see how I was doing that. But when I'm studying science, I'm thinking, now, and I was studying biological oceanography, how's that gonna help the black and brown communities that I moved through in New Jersey? And so that was on my mind. And one day I just happened into a conference that the law school at Harvard was having, and it was on environmental justice. I'd never heard of it. And the thing I still remember to this day is that there was a black staffer, black person, black man that worked at EPA. And they were giving him a hard time. The community was. And I was thinking, why is the community giving this brother such a hard time? What's going on here? And they gave out a reading list at the end of the conference. And I looked at the reading list and I said, I would really like to read this stuff, but I realized I wouldn't on my own. I wasn't reading what I was supposed to be reading for my courses, much longer, something extra. And so I came with the idea of creating a course around it, which I did. So I went to a vice president of Harvard, which I had seen and heard of. His name is Jamie Hoyt, and asked him to teach it. And so he taught the course, and I was a teaching assistant, and we taught it on environmental justice. And kind of a typical academic story where I knew nothing about environmental justice, and here I am helping to teach a course. And in retrospect, I don't know if that was the greatest idea, but that's how I initially got into it. The idea of it, the idea of environmental justice, and then I went on to be a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in their Earth Institute, where I switched to air pollution because I knew it was an environmental justice issue. And while I was there, we started an environmental justice organization in New Jersey, the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. And I met Dr. Joseph Youngblood, who was the head of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at the time. And he actually did he had some funding to do a project on air pollution, local air pollution. And he teamed up with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, which I was part of. And after we did that project, he said, well, Nicky, why don't you come and be the head of the Center for the Urban Environment at the Watson Institute, and you can do environmental justice.
And the rest is history.
You took my words. That was, he said so much there that we have to dive into a little bit. So you talked about this journey of yours, but you mentioned I guess a trigger in terms of air pollution, right? So we all recall last June when we kind of woke up and had that smell of maybe sulfur or something burning, and probably didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was at first. I actually thought somebody in my neighborhood was burning leaves or something. But then we started to notice the air started to get heavy, and then before you know it, businesses and schools and colleges were telling people to come inside, stay inside, and eventually close their doors for some of them, not opening for a day or two until the air quality improved. I was kind of shocked by that. In our time, we're starting to see things we've never seen before. For me, that was certainly a first. I've heard of fires in different areas, but I didn't know the impact it could have potentially on us when we're thousands of miles away. And I actually still don't know necessarily the source of that. But since I have an expert here today, I want to jump into that a little bit. How does this happen where you have these wildfires that spread? We've heard about them in Northern California, but in Canada, it's certainly impacted us. And then how do we avoid those in the future?
So let me tell you what I know. So I'm not an expert on wildfires, but I do a lot of work around the air pollution that you saw. And it was interesting for me. So I was not here when that happened. I was at an environmental justice conference in Atlanta. I'm almost sorry I missed it in a way. But so what you were seeing were high concentrations of fine particulate matter air pollution, or is also called PM 2.5. And the 2.5 refers to the size of the particles. So these were airborne particles. The PM 2.5 refers to the size of the particles. They're equal to or less than 2.5 microns, a millionth of a meter in diameter. And in this case, size is important because that means they're small enough to get into your lungs. And therein lies a problem. Once they get into your lungs, they interact with your bloodstream. They can stay in your lungs. And they're really a high health hazard. For example, I think it was a 2013 report from, I may get the year wrong, from MIT, estimated in 2005, these particles caused 200,000 premature deaths in our country. And that's just one type of air pollution. That's just our country, right, where it caused these premature deaths and all these other and a whole lot of other diseases. It affects your cardiovascular system, your cardiopulmonary system. And the wildfires, and I don't deal with wildfires a lot, but I have to say, I was back in 2013, I was part of, they have what's called the National Climate Assessment about every 3 to 5 years. And our country gets together, a bunch of scientists, and writes this report on what the impacts of climate change are on the country. And I was one of the co-authors of the public health chapter of that report. And, my specialty is environmental justice, local air pollution, urban air pollution. But we had a team, and in that team, we wrote about, because there are other people that are experts, wrote about how there would be more wildfires due to climate change and how it would worsen air pollution. and here was, I hate to say the perfect example, maybe the worst example of what happened. But so this, very concentrated air pollution, the particles come from combustion anytime you burn something. So usually they're not coming from wildfires where we live. So usually they're coming from anytime you see a smokestack, something's being burned and it puts this out in the air, and from transportation, trucks, buses, cars. So this is ubiquitous. We're breathing this stuff in all the time. Where we live, you cannot get away from it. But this was just, usually you don't see it, but this was the worst example of it. And concentrations tend to be highest in communities of color and in communities with low income. And this is actually how I got into climate change. So continue the story. When I came to the Watson Institute, we had just started the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, and we had teamed up with the Watson Institute to do air monitoring. This is what we were monitoring. We were monitoring the PM 2.5 levels in urban neighborhoods in New Jersey with high school students in Trenton, Camden, and Newark, because they are such a health hazard, particularly in urban areas, particularly in communities of color. So when we first started New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, communities were coming with us about air pollution complaints. It's particularly down in Camden, where there were a lot of complaints. There had just been a cement factory built, and they had an incinerator. They have a sewage plant. They have a lot of buses, and this is not atypical, unfortunately, for our neighborhoods in urban areas. And communities were coming to us about the local air pollution, and that's where we started to concentrate our efforts. Then we heard, and by the way, when I say we heard, the people that started this did not come to environmental justice groups, definitely not in New Jersey. We heard about a new program to fight climate change called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI for short. And to fight climate change, you want to reduce greenhouse gases, typically carbon dioxide. Well, we had a different context for that. We want to fight climate change because, and as we said in the National Climate Assessment, climate change disproportionately and detrimentally impacts communities of color and low-income communities. But we want to use climate change mitigation policy not only to fight climate change, but also to fight the local air pollution, the PM 2.5 that you saw, those days in uncharacteristically high concentrations. And that's been the kind of unique aspect of climate change policy we've brought to the table, where you should not only use climate change policy to fight climate change, but to reduce the disproportionate pollution loads we often find in environmental justice neighborhoods. Because the particulate matter, the way climate change, so carbon dioxide causes climate change. Carbon dioxide doesn't affect you directly, at least not out in the open. It hurts you by causing climate change, and climate change hurts you. But the air pollutants that you saw, like the PM 2.5, hurt you now, right? Mm-hmm. That's killing people and making people sick now. And power plants and actually trucks and buses and cars that emit carbon dioxide also emit this PM 2.5 along with the carbon dioxide. So it's emitting stuff, carbon dioxide, that causes climate change, but at the same time it's emitting this other stuff that's killing you now. So we're saying, let's use the climate change policy to both fight climate change and fight the stuff that's killing people now.
And so, Nikki, that's a lot of information that we're taking in. So let's sort of digest that a little bit and process it. And I think for those who are listening, it's easy, I think, for them to understand now, because we had the experience with the Canadian wildfires and actually the haze
Right.
and the smell, that they now can understand, how important it is to combine air pollution and see the connection, the nexus between air pollution and climate change, right? So I think what you all are probably starting to see now is a pivot, right, to air pollution and how that impacts climate change. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the policy journey. So New Jersey was the first state to have a cumulative impact legislation passed, which really looked at pollution and those industries that cause pollution and how we can mitigate additional industries coming into cities that are already burdened by air pollution, right? And again, that's directly contributes to health issues, the cognitive development issues for our children who live in those communities. And just as a reminder to those, the under-resourced communities that I spoke of earlier typically came from redlining. It's a historical context to urban renewal and redlining and why those communities have the incinerators and the factories and so on.
Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack. Let me give you the formal definition of cumulative impacts. It's the risk and impacts caused by multiple sources of pollution and the multiple pollutants that they emit, and the risk and impacts caused by these multiple pollutants, both individually and when they interact with each other, and when they interact with social vulnerabilities that exist in communities. And remember, again, environmental justice communities, we're talking about communities of color, low-income communities. And so you have a lot of social vulnerabilities. I talked about the health disparities that are rooted in race and income. So it's the pollution, the multiple pollutants when they interact with each other and these social vulnerabilities. Informally, think of it as a total amount of pollution in the neighborhood. And again, in communities of color and low-income communities, you have often a disproportionate number of polluting sites and a disproportionate amount of traffic, which leads to a disproportionate amount of pollution. And one of the problems is our laws don't deal with the total amount of pollution in the neighborhood. Our laws set standards for individual pollutants. And unless those individual standards are violated, then the government typically doesn't do much about the pollution. And in the communities where you have these multiple pollutants, the residents come and say, but wait a minute, even though the standard for PM 2.5 is not violated, you have PM 2.5, you have sulfur dioxide, you have nitrogen dioxide, you have hazardous air pollutants, and you're not taking into account all of these at the same time. So even though individual standards not violated, we're still getting sick and being killed because we have this soup of pollution. And so and oftentimes we've said the holy grail of the environmental justice movement has been to say, at some point, when you give out pollution permits, and usually if you have, if you're going to emit a lot of pollution, it's all relative. You have to get some type of pollution permit, whether it's air pollution, solid waste. EJ, the environmental justice, EJ for short movement, and there is a national grassroots EJ movement, has said for years, at some point, when you have all these polluting sites in one community, you got to stop giving out pollution permits. This is not fair. At some point, you got to say enough is enough. Been advocating for that for years, and we finally made the policy breakthrough, Barbara, what you're talking about, in New Jersey, where in 2020, and the environmental justice community in New Jersey has been advocating around this since at least 2007. Developed policies about it for both local and national level, and just very persistently advocated for this. So in 2020, a law was adopted. Senator Singleton from South Jersey, one of our heroes, put forth a bill, and after a year, put forth the bill in 2018, after a year and a half, the bill was adopted, that says under certain circumstances, the state shall deny applications for pollution permits based on cumulative impacts and environmental justice. And that's been a groundbreaking law. Other states are starting to emulate it. New York passed a law. There are other parts of the country that are talking about it. And in New Jersey, we're trying to help the environmental justice community. For example, we're trying to help in New Mexico, might try to help in Seattle. So around the country, other groups and other governments are thinking about this. Now, the connection to climate change. So go back to what I said before, is that we think you should use climate change policy not only to fight climate change, but to fight cumulative impacts. That has been a fairly controversial policy recommendation. We've been working on that since 2008 too. And we say, look, because you have these cumulative impacts, you have to develop policy to address it. And part of the policy, two types of policy I've been arguing lately. One is a type of policy that addresses cumulative impacts through that context, that idea of cumulative impacts. And we have that law passed in New Jersey. But then you're going to need other laws to complement that fight specific areas of pollution. Like, what different types of pollution contribute to the cumulative impacts? Well, part of that pollution comes from power plants. So that's when the bells go off in our head. Okay, well, we need to use policies that affect power plants to fight the cumulative impacts also. So that's where we moved to climate change policy, and we've met resistance. Because for a long time, people have said, no, keep the policies separate. We can fight the cumulative impacts or the air pollution without using climate change policy. And what we're saying is use both. Yeah, you need the separate policy to fight the air pollution, but also add climate change policy on top of it. And we're still fighting that fight.
Thank you for listening to Urban Impact, a podcast produced by Kean, New Jersey's Urban Research University. Subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get podcasts. For more information, visit kean.edu/urban-impact.